Thank you very much for attending this session. Today I'm going to be talking about feedback encounters, feedback practices, and sense making. So in terms of, let me just see. Thank you, Phil. I'm just going to, okay, now you will be able to see my screen. So yeah, perfect. So the ideas that feed into this presentation today come from a pilot study that I have carried out at UCL at the IOE for my my upgrade paper for my MPhil. So what I'm looking at are the relationships between feedback encounters, practices, and sense making. Can I just check that everybody can see my slides now?
Yeah, I can see those.
Yes, good.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to start with what we know about feedback. In general, we know that feedback is an essential fundamental element in learning, especially in higher education, because that's how students know that they what to do in order to improve. What we generally know about feedback is that it's given it's shared in the shape of actionable points in verbal and written comments. But if there are no actionable points, it can hardly be called feedback. Students need to know what to do in order to improve. In recent years, in the last 20 years, research in feedback has gone through a paradigm shift where students, instead of being seen as passive receivers of comments of written or verbal, were seen as taking on a more active role to engage as a proactive recipient of feedback, which means making sense of what is being said, and if sense cannot be made of it, find more information in order to make sense out of that information given, the feedback information. So in order to make sense of information, the next step would be to compare to an ongoing work or performance and make adjustments accordingly. According to Carles and colleagues, this would be what closing a feedback loop is. So again, comparing current performance to a model, making adjustments, making sense of comments, making sense of cues. And that would make a student a proactive recipient of feedback. However, in terms of how feedback is given or elicited, we still feel like there is something that needs to change. So I found a very nice taxonomy of feedback encounters, originated from terms from Esterhazy and Jensen and colleagues, who have classified encounters or interactions where feedback information is shared between different categories. So feedback, and they call them feedback encounters instead of feedback comments or feedback information, because they do not just mean that one gives and the other one receives, but there are two acting, let's say, participants in this interaction. So feedback encounters are loosely interactions that have at its center feedback seeking or elicitation. There is somebody who seeks and needs some information and goes and finds it somewhere. These feedback encounters can be formal, that is when a tutor plans a tutorial or provides comments. Those are the most common feedback encounters we are familiar with. Elicited, these have to do with students finding information in non-human sources such as AI, for example, exemplars or handbooks, textbooks, any other sources that can help students make a comparison between their current performance and the standard or the goal they're aiming to achieve. Or incidental, these are not planned. These can come from human or non-human participants, and they have to do with finding out just by chance some information that can help inform their decisions about their performance. And this could be, as an example, this could be overhearing a conversation between two classmates in a seminar, or a tutor saying something about their work to another classmate and using that as a way to improve on their own performance. This is very common in seminars or in study groups or workshops. The interesting thing about feedback encounters is that students bring in their agency in the form of inquiries to make sense of this new information about their performance. And we're going to focus on this phrase, to make sense of sense making, for today's talk, because that's the part of feedback encounters I'm interested in. So moving on, the present study is based on some interviews I carried out with 4 MA TESOL students at the IOE. These were semi-structured interviews first after draft submission, and then we had another round of interviews after they had their final submission and they received their marks. I also analyzed and examined drafts, formative feedback from their tutors, their final submissions, and the summative feedback that they received at the end of their course. The drafts were for an essay in the module that is called the English language learner. So these students have to analyze the profile of a student of English as a foreign language, and also analyze and analyze their profile as a learner, and also provide an action plan for them to improve and find and support their studies. Okay, so my research questions are: what kind of feedback encounters MA students engage in? What is the relationship between those feedback encounters and the process of sense making? And what is the relationship between enactment and sense making? Because what we tend to think is, okay, I've given the student feedback, they are going to do exactly what I think they should be doing. But there are lots of elements in between the provision of feedback and what the student ends up doing. So those are the things I wanted to explore in these studies. So what I found out is that that students engage in many different feedback encounters. The most common one was formal. These are formal comments from tutors to students, and they can be made verbally or in the written form. And here are some examples you can read from my data. What obviously these were the most common ones because students got feedback in a written draft first, and it was written, the comments were written, and then they had the opportunity to meet their tutors to talk about those comments in an academic tutorial. So that's those are formal encounters. Moving on, there were some elicited encounters. I realized that some of them also referred to exemplars from previous students that the teacher provided. Samples, they call them exemplars or samples or good assignments. Also, the handbook provided some marking criteria or some guidelines that they used as a way to see if they were on the right track, and ChatGPT as well. It was interesting to see how they used it to refine grammar, to refine spelling, but I also noticed that they were quite judicious in the use of it. They sometimes decided that some of the suggestions were not good enough. And then there were some incidental ones. These were the least common encounters. For example, in group tutorials, they made the most of listening to what other students, what comments other students received from the tutor, or discussions together. So they shared what wasn't very clear for them. And that is a kind of feedback. It's checking that things are not clear. It's great to know what encounters can be exploited in learning, but also the next element we need to look at is sense making. What is involved in sense making? I'm using a framework that is also, well, that has been, that is very well explained by Chen 2024 and by Cowell in 2024 as well, who are very good at explaining what happens when what happens cognitively when new information comes into contact with our conscience. So if we are, there are three things that can happen. We get new information, it can fit with our old knowledge, and that means, okay, I revisit old assumptions, that fits, perfect, in you go in the box that you belong to, let's say. Um, that is one, that is new information, revisiting of assumptions. Another thing can happen, new information comes in, it, it is misaligned with the existing knowledge I have. So an adjustment needs to happen so I can change that new information, or I can change my own assumptions in order to fit that new information. Another thing can happen, that is, if there is a misalignment between the new information and my pre-existing information, I might want to make an adjustment, but I might not know how to. So when the adjustment is not, there is no actionable point to implement, is that's when there is a gap in knowledge, and the gap is noticed and it's there. So these three elements in sense making are what I use to code my data as well. So I used encounters, I used elements of sense making in three different categories, and I realized that some of them co-occurred. But first, I would like to talk about what happens when there is a gap. Why is it important to have a gap for sense making, for the process of sense making? If the student cannot fit existing knowledge to something, new information to existing knowledge, and doesn't have elements to make the adjustment, they will have a gap, and that gap is important because if the student has enough opportunities and the awareness of all the other encounters that there could be in feedback, they will go and look for the information elsewhere. And if there are no gaps, there is no need for readjustments or adjustments. So noticing a gap and for the process of sense making, for gaps to be there is very important. However, that needs to lead to actionable points. So how do we do it? There are two different things that can happen in order for students to make sense of those gaps. One is, I'm going to say this before we move on to the encounters. One is to provide opportunities for looking for information elsewhere, which can be another kind of encounters, like elicited encounters. But another way is in the feedback dialogues to provide examples and let students ask questions. So these two things will help us make sense of what happens later. So examples and proactive recipients, let's say, going and asking more questions. But without a feedback dialogue, that is a bit difficult. So let's hold that thought for a second and let's move on. So what happens with feedback encounters? I'm sorry if I'm going to make this a bit quantitative today because I'm going to show a few numbers, but we don't have to worry about all of the numbers. I had 4 participants. I had different kinds of encounters, formal, elicited, and incidental. Obviously, there are some little categories in between. Don't worry about them, but within the formal encounters, I had feedback dialogues with examples and without examples. So this is where the tutor just gave there was an opportunity to talk, but examples on how to improve didn't take place. And then within elicited could have been from AI, from an exemplar, and from incidental, they were just incidental. As you can see, participant 2 had the highest number of encounters and the highest variety, the widest variety of encounters. And that is interesting because if we move on, we're going to look at the instances of sense making where each student showed through their speech, through their their comments in interviews, how they found a gap in their understanding, how they made an adjustment, how they were revisiting some of the assumptions they had in their knowledge, and how they tried to find extra information through proactive inquiry. So, and then there were instances of unsuccessful sense making, which we will see later on. Participant 2 was the one who had the highest incidences of sense making overall. And it could be correlated to the fact that this student had multiple encounters, which is interesting because relying on just one source of feedback might not be the way forward, might not be as beneficial as having many sources. Moving on. So if we look at feedback encounters and the correlation between feedback encounters and successful sense making, we can see that formal feedback encounters with all of their subcodes were mostly correlated with adjustment. So feedback comments from a tutor led to adjustment, possibly because they were told how to do it. And if you look at feedback dialogues with examples, the highest incidence was with successful sense-making adjustment. Why? Because maybe the tutor gave them exactly the kind of example they needed to improve. However, when there were no examples, students were left with a gap. This is not right. My tutor told me this is not right, but I have no clue what to do afterwards. So these are just things that obviously, I mean, these are things that co-occurred on the data. This doesn't mean that one thing follows from the other. That's another kind of analysis I did later on. But let's move on and see what happens next. So are we talking about a gap or are we talking about adjustment in sense making? Just to explain the numbers we've just looked at, we can see that the highest number, the greatest number of sense making codes were assigned to adjustments. And this is when students try to adjust their previous assumptions to accommodate new information and to adjust their performance to the comparison after a comparison with the standard presented by the tutor. For example, we have this participant who was looking for the term better than better, the term better. So this person was told that better was not good enough. So they came up with something, but this is an adjustment, and we have different options. So this is evidence of an adjustment taking place. In terms of giving examples or not giving examples, when they were given examples of how to improve, students made an adjustment immediately. For example, being told that a word is redundant and which word is redundant, they would take it away and they would make sense of it. They would realize that is not needed. With this example, I'm making sense of this comment. And another way is also using a framework that is being. It's not just about superficial corrections in terms of grammar, spelling, or use of language. It's, for example, the framework, the Common European Framework to decide what to describe the level of a learner. I think that the student at the beginning was just saying it's a very strong speaker, but not a very strong writer. And the tutor suggested using the categories in the Common European Framework. So this is an example. Now, what happens when there is a gap? When there isn't an example, when there is no adjustment, and the sense making only helps us realize that there is, I mean, the feedback only as sense making comes out only as a gap, as an awareness of a gap. So some students, all of them in the interviews, show that there were gaps. They might have created confusion when there are no examples, but they do encourage proactive inquiry in some cases. So they realize that tutors' input is not enough to develop that feedback comment into actionable points. So they need to go and find the actionable points somewhere else. And that those somewhere else's sometimes include examples, examples that were not shared in informal feedback encounters. So these students, for example, mention information online, for examples, to analyze the pronunciation, another tutorial in the academic writing center at the IOE. The UCL library to start to find keywords. They were writing about the motivations of the students in their essay, and they found other assignments that spoke about the same thing, and academic vocabulary courses at UCL. So as you can see, the example in the feedback dialogue is a crucial element, because if it doesn't appear in the formal encounter, it might be needed somewhere else for some students. In some other cases, there is sense making, but there is a formal dialogue, a feedback dialogue. There are examples, but the sense making doesn't exist or doesn't really follow. This student was told that in order to simplify her, to make her writing more concrete, more succinct, they needed to use fewer words. It's too wordy. And the problem was the teacher just told them, look, remove this adverb. The students embraced that word adverb. Meta language is sometimes a disadvantage in feedback dialogues. And they just assumed that by removing all of the adverbs in any sentence, they would be making their language or their prose more academic and their writing a bit more succinct. This is a very good example of unsuccessful sense making, because not some adverbs are necessary. So moving on, let's look at the relationship between sense making and enactment. And in this table, we can see that successful sense making leads and adjustment when there is, and when we know or the student knows how to make the change, concrete enactment follows or co-occurs. However, sometimes there are cases like the one I've just shared where unsuccessful sense making, because there is meta language involved, follows, and then there is a vague enactment, some enactment that the students, when I say enactment, is the students saying why they did something in the final submission. And they just say, well, I changed my coherence, I changed my logic, I made it more succinct. That's vague. You're not exactly describing what you did, because there isn't an actionable point that you go through. Okay, so you can see that sometimes enactment doesn't necessarily mean sense making. So examples, though, we can lead to enactment. So for example, some students were told, well, you need to write as if you were telling a story or drawing a picture of a learner. So I have made it more specific. I have described the learner. That's an example that led to a more concrete enactment. Another thing is explaining different terminology that might be unknown to a reader from here. Developing the idea of the reader is a very good way of giving examples in feedback dialogue, so that students can understand what they need to define more clearly and what they cannot, or they should not. But does enactment mean sense making? If the student has done something, does it mean that they made sense of the reason why they did it? Sometimes it's not the case. There is one student I want to focus on now, so that I can take you through the feedback loop or the feedback trajectory that this student went through. Why? Because this student was very worried about hedging language, which was the thing that really ruined her experience. She was very, very worried about it. She was always being told that hedging language at draft stage and also at the end. And her final words in the second interview were, sometimes I think it's right to use it, but why should I use hedging language again and again in every sentence? So let's have a look at her trajectory. First, she submitted a draft. I'm not going to ask you to read all of it, but I'm going to just go over it quickly. The tutor, after this section of the draft, the tutor commented, there are some, you make some statements, they do look like you're too sure of this. Consider using hedging language so that you're not too definite about what you're saying, which is a very fair point. Then the student at the interview after the draft told me it was very useful to have the tutorial with the tutor, and I had a lot of questions about hedging language. Fine. The final submission in the same section of the draft, it can be seen that the student did add some hedging language sentences, some phrases. And for that section, in general, they for part one of this of the final submission, the tutor said hedging language is needed. But in the one that she submitted and changed, it says you have used very good hedging language. So the student got specific feedback about hedging language in part three of her submission, the one that says that is entitled pronunciation. But in part one, she didn't use as much hedging language. So she still got the comment. This is what led to the confusion after the final submission in the second interview, where she said, I know I need to avoid being sounding too decisive in sentences. I tried to find some hedging language examples, but I still don't know how to use it. So why do I have to use it again and again and again? Why isn't it not enough? And that's not a problem with the use of language. That's the problem with academic conventions that need to be approached in a different way. So as you can see, enactment does not necessarily lead or mean that there is sense making taking place. So I'm going to just go over some of the conclusions that this pilot study has helped me see, and then some implications for teaching. So some of the data that we have looked at from the 7 interviews, that is, there was one student who didn't do the second interview, have highlighted a range of feedback encounters, and the most common one is formal interactions. A wider variety of encounters can certainly lead to deeper instances of sense making. And this is in conjunction with literature by experts, Nicole and Molloy. You will see them in my references. They say that the more sources of feedback a student can be in touch with, the more enriching the learning cycle will become. Within sense making, the most common operation was adjustment. And that comes in general hand in hand with examples in formal encounters. Interestingly, successful sense making can arise from formal encounters even when they don't include dialogue, but enactment is not always ensured. And at the same time, enactment does not always mean that sense making has taken place. And dialogue-rich encounters, proactive inquiry, and the use of contextualized examples generally support more successful sense-making of feedback and subsequent enactment. In terms of teaching, what do we need to remember in order, from this talk, what can we do with our students? Get students to understand that they are the ones who can activate encounters. Can they do, but from our feedback, do they have enough information to transform feedback into actionable points? And if they don't, because we're not, machines that just provide feedback to students, where else could they find useful information? Can we give them sources for them to go and find out more? Formal encounters followed by feedback dialogues are essential, but pointing at a gap is not giving feedback. It's what can they do about that gap. Also, encourage students to ask questions in feedback dialogues, or tell them to tell you where would they like feedback on, because they might think, oh, they didn't give me any feedback. Well, then I won't do anything. And it's not on you. They need to know that they have ownership of feedback too. Also, as we can see, examples are very important, but we cannot produce examples for everything. So encourage the use of exemplars and rubrics that have some samples embedded in them. And if in some cases, ethical use of AI can be beneficial for eliciting some of these examples that can lead to successful enactment and sense making. So here are uh, my references, and I will be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much for your time and for listening.